Hi, greetings, the UX community. I'm very pleased to be doing this second episode about how to talk to participants, how to master participant engagement and rapport in UX sessions. So, this is the second episode of a series of two. So, if you haven't listened to the first episode, I highly encourage you to do so. You will learn a lot about how to build rapport with participants before the user session, how to put the participant at ease at the beginning of a user session, the flow of an interview, and a lot more insights. And today, in this second episode, as promised, we will cover the do's and don'ts of how to talk to users to maximize rapport and in the end, to get the most out of your interview. And as I was saying, this will be in a do's and don'ts format, but I will not do as you might find it traditionally, as first the don'ts and then the do's, or first the do's and then the don'ts. No, I will cover it topic by topic, and you will have a don't and then the corresponding, as much as possible, do that you should follow. So here we begin. First of all, of course, do not ask close-ended questions. When you're doing interviews, ultimately, the goal is to gather information about things you do not know. So I like to see that as I do not know what I do not know, basically. You know what you want to know, but you lack matter. You lack qualitative data. You lack deep insights. And so asking close-ended questions will not help you to gather these deep insights. So let me give you an example. So for instance, if you want to study, let's say, the habit of practicing a physical activity in a given area, imagine this is the topic of your UX research study. One bad way to do it, if your objective is to understand the habits of people in this area to practice sport, when do they do it, how do they do it, the frequency and so on, for instance, and the why behind it, what type of exercises and so on, you would not ask a question such as, do you do sports on weekend? Because your participant might answer yes or no, and end of story. You will simply will not have an answer to your question. You will not gather deep insights. So in this case, the corresponding what you should really do would be to ask the broadest questions as possible. And for that, we have a framework which is also used in problem statement definitions in UX design. But ultimately, I like to think of that as a natural consequence of UX research principles, because when you want to know something in UX research, you use this framework, and by using this framework, you will gather insights that in the end will help you define a problem statement, which is also articulated the same way. Let me explain myself. The framework is as follows. It's called the 5WH1. Maybe you already came across it, and maybe now the dots will connect in your head. So 5W stands for what, when, who, why, and where. And then you have H1, which stands for how. So basically, broad questions that you should ask in qualitative user sessions or interview will begin with these words: what, when, who, why, where, and how. And ultimately, these words and these questions will help you gather deep insights on your participants regarding what they do, why do they do it, or what is their problem, what is their pain point, why is that a pain point, when do they experience this pain point, for instance, who is the user, where are they at this moment when they experience a pain point, and how do they currently deal with the situation. And when you start a discovery studies, foundational UX research, That's where you should start in general. And with real foundational and discovery studies, you would not always have the answers to these questions. So that is why when you're a UX designer in general and you cannot afford, I will not enter into the politics of affording or not to do research. This is for maybe another episode. But if you're a UX designer and you cannot conduct research for whatever reason, in general, you start from the problem statement and you start building a problem statement from assumptions. And you are told in general to follow this framework of the 5WH1. But ultimately, this framework would work way better if it was informed by data coming from UX research, following the same principles of asking these questions to the user. So, for instance, an example of a broad question could be, when do you track your expenses? Or why do you track your expenses? Another bad example, just to come back to it, could be, do you track your expenses often? So it's bad for several reasons, of course, because it's closed-ended, because the often, this idea of the frequency which does not have a reference, so often for someone can be several times a day, but for another person can be several times a week, or for another person can be once a month. You do not have any reference of that. But this was not the topic, mentioning just in case. Then another don't. Do not read your script, of course. You want to maximize participants' engagement. You want to maximize, let's say, have the best flow as possible. Ultimately, an interview should be like a conversation. It should not be. You should not make the participant feel as if they are interrogated. So to do that, of course, as in a traditional interview, you should be focused and have 100% of your attention dedicated to your participant. And I covered that in the previous episode. So again, if you haven't listened to it, I highly encourage you to. For me, I deeply believe that attentional resources are finished, are limited, let's say. So you begin in one given situation with 100% of your attention, and depending on how you allocate these resources, then in each of the activities you will have a lower percentage of attention that you can dedicate to this activity. So imagine I am running an interview with 100% of my attention. If at the same time I am required to read my script, maybe I will be, somewhere at 70% dedicated to my participant and 30% reading my script, something like this, more or less. Because there is data showing that even if you read something, you can still listen to something else, you can focus even if you're not looking at your participant. We are entering into the neuroscience. I am sorry for that. I did neuroscience and our teachers were really on top of that. But still, it's not because you can listen while you're reading at something that you are being 100% efficient at both tasks. So, and it's the same if you add on top of that you have to write, to take notes of what your participant is saying, you decrease furthermore all the attentional resources that you can dedicate to your participant. So basically, my advice here would be, of course, to be prepared, to have your set of questions in your head. And that is why a corollary to that would be to have your script, prepared, but also lean, so that you can be as much prepared as you want. But in the end, if your script is super complex and super long, you will not maybe be able to learn it by heart, to know it by heart, or to remember it. So that is why it should be lean. And in general, how can I say, an interview, the time you can devote to an interview in the end, there should be almost a standard in terms of timing. So we say somewhere between 20 and 45 minutes. It depends on the interviews. To be honest, when I run interviews, so over the years, maybe I ran over 80 interviews, between 80 and 100 interviews. And I can tell you, in my opinion, the best ones have been in the range of 20 minutes, more or less. Of course, shorter can be best, but then it depends on the return of investment you can have. Maybe with less than 20, you will not learn that much on your participants. Maybe, but maybe not. So my advice would be to aim for 20 minutes for the duration of your interviews. And that is why, in general, if you aim for these 20 minutes, well, then you do a kind of, how can I say, a planning, but like backwards, of what you should include in your script to reach these 20 minutes. Or basically, maybe see it another way. You have 20 minutes to spend, and you have these amounts of questions. What questions can you include to fill everything in 20 minutes, and not use more than that? That's my point. So that's why, in general, I advise to have a kind of 4 research questions or 4 macro objectives for your research. And for each research question or objective, more or less, I would try to squeeze in maximum 2 questions. And by questions here, I mean user questions, let's say, user session questions. So that would be the questions you will ask to your participants in your user sessions. Of course, always take into account that some follow-up would be necessary. So, for instance, if you ask, when do you track your expenses? Imagine your participant tells you something that is surprising. You can ask why, because you want to follow up. Always include the follow-ups in the potential time you will take to run your interviews, of course. Another a guideline that you should always strive to respect when you run your interviews, and I am not sure, but maybe I talked about it in the previous episode, is of course to use a note taker. And again, I know that a lot of you will tell me, but now we have automatic transcription tools with analysis. Well, I can tell you I'm using them oftentimes, and it's not as perfect as we can expect them to be, because I guess AI is still at the beginning regarding these tools, so I would not trust them 100% when it comes to interviews and when it comes to transcript and automatic analysis. I think the human mind has a better ability to abstract, to represent concepts in an abstract way, and to focus on only the important elements. That is the idea. And also you can do that in the moment, because you know your research questions, you know your topic, you know your problems. So I would advise really to have a note taker to whom you would pitch your research questions and your objectives, and this note taker could filter out the irrelevant by taking notes only on what is really necessary. So that was about being focused on the interview. And also, of course, having a note taker serves other purposes and has also other benefits, such as, of course, having a second pair of ears and eyes. You can discuss with the person later. You can summarize with the person later. You have better data quality, because you can also, the note taker doesn't have to write everything down, but can write the timings of the quotes. So not only the note taker can summarize instantly with the ability of the human mind to abstract things, but also can take note of the important timings when things were said, and then relate all of the things together, basically. Then the third aspect I wanted to talk about is about when your participants, when the flow, let's say, of your interview, or at least regarding your expectations, is disturbed. Let's say you were expecting to cover a topic at the beginning of the interview, but in the end, or at the end of the interview, rather, and your participant talks about this at the beginning, so it was not expected. Okay, there is still a thin line in this, because it depends for how long your participant is talking about this. But in general, as a rule of thumb, I would absolutely not interrupt my participant. Never ever interrupt your participant in this case, because you will interrupt the flow of their thinking, and the flow of their thinking the second time will never be the same as the first time. It will never be as raw, never be as pure, let's say, because when your participant talks, they are putting their thoughts together, and so if you interrupt that, then it will not be the same, basically. So I will not interrupt, I will listen to that. And this is also another a justification for me to tell you to have a note taker, because your note taker is able to parse the information that is told before you were expecting it to be. So basically, at this moment, take note of what is being said, so that later in the conversation, either you come back to it if it's not enough, or you build upon it during the interview itself. Because in the end, it has to be a conversation. Again, when you talk to someone and this person is telling you something you were expecting to talk later in the conversation, well, first of all, this in general doesn't happen. But you would not tell the person, no, wait, I want to talk about that later. Well, except for very structured conversations, maybe meetings with your colleagues, but in general, it's not the case. When you have a conversation with a friend or with a relative, you will not do that. So it has to be more or less as, let's say, human. And so this is the first thing. The second thing is, of course, not to interrupt your participant still, but related to another topic, which is, imagine your participant is talking for something that is irrelevant but for too long. So yeah, of course, do not interrupt, because you never know if at some point the participant is saying something that seems irrelevant but is getting to a point that will make sense in the end. Imagine, for instance, they talk in analogies. It can happen. So always wait a bit. You never know. If it begins to be really too long, I would advise to wait for a silence and really do not interrupt your participant, or really do not communicate to your participant that what they said was irrelevant. Because, as I was mentioning in the first episode, this is something they should never feel, that what they're saying is irrelevant. They should feel that everything they're mentioning could be used to improve their experience. There is no judgment, there is no right or wrong answer. So do not make them feel this way. Just recenter them very softly, mentioning, now let's talk about blah, 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 so that you could recenter them. And of course, again, this is also related to not interrupting your participant, but this time related to silences. And it has to do with not interrupting the flow of their thinking. When your participant is silent, oftentimes it's because they are collecting their thoughts. And so I really advise against interrupting that. Of course, if it's really long and you understand that the participant has nothing else to say, you have also to try to monitor their expressions, their way of talking. Again, come back to the first episode in which I tell you that when you begin an interview, you ask soft questions that will allow you to determine if your participant is more talkative or more reserved. So this way you would be able to know that, okay, this participant, when there is a silence, in general, it means that they have nothing else to say, for instance. So in this case, I would use the silence as an ally, because it can tell a lot. First of all, you can analyze them as such. A silence means a lot by itself. So you can take note of that. Participant is silent for, let's say, 3 seconds, is thinking. And if it occurs a lot, you can say participant seems dubitative, or this kind of things, okay? And then it has also another it's powerful for another reason. It's that your participant, some of them, when they are silent and you do not say anything, it will pressure them. Not in a negative way, just the right amount, so that they will share more information, because oftentimes as humans we do not like silences. We're not used to that. And so it depends the amount of confidence you have, but really more often than not, when I have participants in front of me and I leave room for silences, well, my participants will follow up naturally. So they will expand on what they were saying before naturally. So this is something that I really encourage. Again, the next point will be about not accepting what your participant says as a face value with no further explanation. Let me give you an example. If you ask your participant, what do you think, how do you feel when using our app? Your participant answers, well, I feel happy. That's it. Nothing else. So you would apply my previous rule, of course, and you will leave a bit of room for silence, for instance, but maybe it's not enough and your participant is not saying anything else. You should absolutely not go on to the next question at this moment. And I will tell you why. Oftentimes, for junior UX researchers or people who do research but are not used to interview best practices, let's say, they would move on. It's something that happens, and it's not a problem in itself as long as you know the risks that you're taking, and as long as you learn to do better the next time. Okay, if you ask this kind of question to your participant and your participant answers, I feel happy, or fine, or yeah, it's easy, yeah, it's intuitive. Okay. Imagine you would take this kind of feedback to your designer or your product manager. You say to your product manager or designer, yeah, they say it's intuitive. Or, yeah, I feel happy. Okay, they will tell you, yeah, okay, it's great. That means we do not have to change the app, maybe. So maybe for now it's okay, but you will never know what were the ingredients that made the app or the feature exciting or intuitive. So yeah, basically it's like if when you watch a movie, if you say, yeah, it was good, yeah, why, what did you like, what was the best moment, what didn't you like, what this made you think about, for instance. So all of this will help you in the future when you know the ingredients, what makes something beautiful, what makes something intuitive, what makes something understandable, to reuse this kind of ingredients in the future to continue to improve in the same direction. So to do that, you have to follow up. And as I was saying before, silence is a good ally. It's a kind of follow up in this case, let's say. But there are a lot of others. So the first type of follow-up could be simply repeating the last word that was said by your participant. So for instance, if they say, yeah, the app is really intuitive, you would say, it's intuitive, you say, for instance. And they would say, yeah, by that I mean blah, blah, blah. Or if they say, yeah, it's intuitive, again, well, you will have to follow up another way. So maybe, I think in my opinion, there is a scale, there is an axis of following up from the most subtle to the most obvious. And I would always use the most subtle first. The most subtle for me would be, of course, the silence. Then you would have maybe the or the repeating the last word. But then if it doesn't work, of course, you could use techniques such as why. Simply you ask why. Because then they will deep dive on the reasons that made them answer this way. And now progressing on my next don't, which is linked to this aspect. I encourage you to use the why, to use follow-ups and so on, but be careful with that. Some follow-ups can come across sometimes as conflictive and as intimidating. The goal is not to intimidate your users. And I'm not saying that's your intention, but sometimes we say, we use words that are not understood the way we intend them to be. So, for instance, if your participant says, I do not manage to control my expenses, for instance, in this case, your participant is sharing something very, how can I say, private, intimate, something that touches to their ability to manage a budget, and maybe they are ashamed of that. It depends on the topic. Of course, you have sensitive topics, and in this type of cases, if you simply ask why, well, maybe not all participants, but some of them can feel intimidated by this question, and it can reinforce this idea that they are doing something wrong, and this is not what you want to communicate, of course. So in this case, what I like to do is substitute the why by what made you blah, blah, blah. Or what makes you not being able to, because it communicates the idea to the participant that the reason to that is exterior to themselves. It's something else. What makes you? It's exterior to them, and maybe they have no control over it. So you imply by saying that they have no control over it, and so that it's not their fault. So it's really different. Some 3 words can change everything. And we are here, we're not in an exact science, so it's really about a feeling, but this is also my feeling from years of experience that I'm trying to communicate to you. Also, something that is linked to this idea of desirability, this desirability bias, you will, of course, reduce it as much as possible if you do not judge your participant. Well, not as much as possible. You should absolutely restrain from judging your participant, of course. So, judging, of course, you're already imagining what constitutes judging. So, for instance, saying an idea is stupid, maybe not using that word, but dismissing an idea or answering negatively to something that was said by your participant, saying that something is wrong, something is good, something is bad. Bringing some judgment of valence. This should not be done at all costs, basically, first of all. But then you have also other more subtle ways to judge that sometimes we do not think about, such as facial expressions. So be careful with that. Be careful with the smiles, the laughs. Sometimes we can, and I also speak from experience, we can be a bit tired when we run interviews, and how do we say? I'm not sure we say that in English, but blowing air, this kind of, I'm tired. This is something that your participant might interpret the wrong way. So try to remain as neutral as possible. And this is something that is also linked to my next point about a next don't, which is building rapport is good, of course, but try to avoid to build too much rapport. You do not want your participant to think you are friends and that they should please you, and that you have all the power to make the changes in the application that you are assessing with them. No. So this is also something that can happen. Happened to me in the past when you begin warming up the interview, let's say, the interviewee, and you have a laugh on some topics, and sometimes the interviewee will say something funny and then the participant might think they're kind of your friend, and it should not happen this way, because then you can never ensure that what they said was neutral and was unbiased. So basically that, and to finish with that, for questions about the behavior, I would say to never ask the participant what they do. Always observe them doing what you want to know about what they do, basically, if that makes sense. So when you ask someone, how often do you exercise in a week? Well, they could maybe tell you if they're not ashamed, because I'm not saying they should be ashamed, but yeah, there are some topics that are linked to desirability, and so yeah. But maybe another example could be, tell me about your morning routine, or tell me about the sequence of steps you follow when you go inside your car. Well, your participant might think they know, but sometimes it's so procedural, it's so ingrained in their working memory, in their procedural memory, that they sometimes they won't even remember. There is this saying that is taught in neuroscience and psychology, that some abilities that we have, we cannot explain how we do them. So for some things linked to behaviors, I would tell you to observe and not ask your participant. What you can do instead is a combination. You can, of course, record your participants doing a task in a usability, for instance, or it can be themselves. They can record themselves when they do a task in a diary study, for instance, and then you look together at the video and you ask some follow-up questions, and you can say, oh, at this moment you did that, why? And then you can deep dive, and this will produce the most amazing insights. And that was it for the episode of today. I would really like to thank all my listeners who listen to the episodes regularly, and I hope this episode helped you, and I cannot wait to do the next ones. If you have any question, if you want to appear in the podcast, suggestions, things you want to share, please again head over to UX-change.com. There are some forms there, introduction about myself. You can publish something. You can write to me, and I would be really, really happy to read about you. And yeah, who knows? Maybe then feature you in my upcoming episodes, if that's something you would like to. Thank you very much for listening, and see you in my next episode. Bye-bye.